Margaret Winters, a 52-year-old retired schoolteacher, lived in a pristine suburban neighborhood where the lawns were manicured, the sidewalks spotless, and the routines predictable. Her days started the same way every morning. She would wake up at 6 a.m. sharp, brew her coffee, and step onto her porch to survey the peaceful streets she had called home for over 25 years. Margaret took pride in her neighborhood. It wasn't just where she lived. It was, in her mind, a reflection of her values: order, discipline, and tradition. Margaret was a petite woman with neatly cropped gray hair, often dressed in pressed slacks and pastel cardigans. Despite her calm exterior, she carried with her a sharp tongue and even sharper opinions. Her daily routine included a brisk walk around the block, during which she would exchange pleasantries with a select group of neighbors she deemed respectable. These were people who, like her, had lived in the neighborhood for decades and shared her unspoken code of maintaining its character. Her environment was a reflection of her meticulous nature. Margaret's home was spotless, adorned with framed family photos, antique furniture, and perfectly aligned bookshelves. Everything had its place, just as she believed everyone had their role in society. However, the neighborhood had begun to change. Younger families were moving in, bringing with them vibrant gardens, noisy children, and diversity Margaret wasn't accustomed to. Among these new residents was the Williams family, a cheerful black family who had moved in just 3 months ago. The Williams family consisted of James, a high school history teacher, his wife, Angela, a nurse, and their 2 children, Marcus, 10, and Mia, 7. They were known for their warmth and community spirit, often hosting small gatherings and playing lively games in their backyard. While many neighbors embraced the Williams family, Margaret viewed them as a disruption to the peace she had cultivated. During her morning walks, Margaret would often pass the Williams house and find herself frowning at their colorful garden or the sound of Marcus laughing loudly as he played basketball with his father. She told herself it wasn't about race. It was about noise, disruption, and change, things she had grown to resent. Yet, deep down, there was an unease she couldn't quite admit to herself. One sunny afternoon, Margaret watched from her living room window as the Williams family hosted a barbecue. Neighbors gathered, children laughed, and music played softly in the background. Margaret felt a pang of irritation. "Don't they realize this is a quiet neighborhood?" she muttered under her breath. Her unease only grew as she overheard snippets of conversations praising the Williams family for their kindness and generosity. Margaret, however, remained unconvinced. She began to feel increasingly isolated in a neighborhood that no longer resembled the one she had known. The seeds of conflict were planted, though neither Margaret nor the Williams family could yet see the storm brewing on the horizon. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when the incident occurred. Margaret was pruning the roses in her front yard, her sharp gardening shears snipping away at stray stems. Across the street, the Williams family was setting up for another of their cheerful get-togethers. Angela was arranging chairs on the lawn while James fired up the grill. Marcus and Mia darted around, laughing and chasing bubbles that floated lazily into the air. Margaret paused and frowned, her gaze fixed on the scene. The noise grated on her nerves, and she felt a familiar irritation bubbling to the surface. She tried to focus on her gardening, but found herself glancing up repeatedly. The sound of car doors slamming broke her concentration. A group of friends arrived, greeted with warm hugs and laughter. Margaret's irritation turned to indignation. "This is getting out of hand," she muttered, dropping her shears onto the grass. From her perspective, the gathering seemed too large, too loud, and too disruptive. She told herself it wasn't personal. It was about maintaining order in the neighborhood. Then came the final straw. Marcus, while playing tag with Mia, accidentally kicked a soccer ball into Margaret's yard. The ball landed on her prized hydrangeas, flattening a few blossoms. Marcus, ever polite, ran over to retrieve it. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," he said earnestly, his big brown eyes filled with genuine apology. But Margaret wasn't interested in his apology. Her voice was icy as she replied, "You need to be more careful. This is why we have rules about where to play." Marcus nodded quickly, retrieving the ball and hurrying back to his yard. He didn't tell his parents about the encounter, but Margaret had already made up her mind. Margaret stormed into her house, grabbed her phone, and dialed the non-emergency police line. "There's a large gathering happening at 482 Maple Lane," she said. "It's creating a disturbance, and I'm not sure it's entirely legal. There are children running all over, and I'm concerned about safety." The operator assured her that an officer would be dispatched. Margaret hung up, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. She peered out her window as a police car rolled into the neighborhood 15 minutes later. The cheerful atmosphere in the Williams yard shifted instantly. James stepped forward to speak with the officer, his body language calm but visibly tense. Angela gathered the children, holding Mia close to her side. Neighbors watched from their porches, their murmurs of concern growing louder. Margaret stayed inside, peering through her curtains, her heart pounding. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see James gesturing toward his home and the officer nodding. After a few tense minutes, the officer left and the gathering resumed, albeit more subdued. Margaret's satisfaction was short-lived. Within hours, whispers spread throughout the neighborhood about the call. People speculated about who had reported the family, and several neighbors expressed outrage. Margaret tried to justify her actions to herself, insisting it wasn't about race but about rules and respect for the neighborhood. Yet, a gnawing sense of unease began to creep in. Unbeknownst to Margaret, someone had recorded the interaction with the officer and posted it on social media. By evening, the video had gained traction, with comments pouring in condemning the caller's actions as racist and unnecessary. Margaret's phone buzzed repeatedly with notifications from her neighborhood group chat, where the incident was being hotly debated. As she read the messages, her stomach sank. Many neighbors openly defended the Williams family and criticized the anonymous complaint. One message, in particular, stood out. "This isn't the neighborhood I thought it was. We should be celebrating families like the Williamses, not targeting them." Margaret closed the chat, her hands trembling. She had intended to restore order, but instead, she had ignited a firestorm she wasn't prepared to face. By the next morning, the atmosphere in the neighborhood was palpably tense. Margaret awoke to find her mailbox stuffed with flyers from a neighborhood social justice group that had quickly formed in support of the Williams family. The flyer featured a bold headline, "Stand Against Intolerance, Support the Williams Family." It included a photograph of James and Angela smiling warmly in front of their home. Margaret felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she skimmed through the message. It accused the caller, her, though no one had explicitly named her yet, of attempting to disrupt a peaceful family gathering out of prejudice. She crumpled the flyer and tossed it into the trash, her face burning with shame and frustration. Throughout the day, she noticed neighbors giving her curt nods instead of their usual warm greetings. Others avoided eye contact altogether. A group of teenagers walked by her house, one of them loudly saying, "I can't believe someone would do that. So messed up." Margaret felt like the walls were closing in. That evening, she found herself glued to her phone, scrolling through social media posts about the incident. The video taken by a neighbor had gone viral, with thousands of comments condemning her actions. The phrase "Karen behavior" was mentioned repeatedly. But what struck Margaret the most was the outpouring of support for the Williams family. People shared stories of James helping students after school, Angela volunteering at a community clinic, and the children organizing lemonade stands for charity. Margaret's initial sense of righteousness began to crumble. For the first time, she felt the weight of her actions beyond her personal discomfort. The next day, Margaret spotted James and Marcus outside, fixing a fence in their yard. She hesitated before stepping outside. She wanted to apologize, or at least explain herself, but every time she rehearsed the words in her head, they sounded hollow. "Good morning," she said tentatively, approaching the property line. James looked up, his expression neutral but guarded. "Morning, Ms. Winters," he replied, his voice polite but distant. "I just wanted to say," Margaret hesitated, fidgeting with her cardigan. "About the other day, I was only trying to—" James raised a hand, cutting her off. "Ms. Winters, I'm not here to argue. I just want to make sure my family feels safe in this neighborhood, just like everyone else." The calm firmness in his voice left Margaret speechless. She nodded mutely and retreated into her house, her cheeks flushed with humiliation. Later that week, Margaret attended a neighborhood meeting that had been hastily organized to address community relations. The meeting was held at the local library, and the room was packed. Margaret sat in the back, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Angela stood at the front, holding a microphone. Her voice was steady but filled with emotion as she spoke about her family's experience. "We moved here because we believed this was a community where our children could thrive," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "We've met so many kind people, but the incident last weekend reminded us that not everyone sees us as equals. It's painful, but it's also a chance for us to grow together." The room erupted in applause. Margaret sat frozen, guilt gnawing at her as Angela's words echoed in her mind. Toward the end of the meeting, an elderly neighbor named Ruth stood up. She addressed the room with a calm but firm voice. "We're not here to point fingers," she said. "But whoever made that call needs to understand the damage it caused. This is a wake-up call for all of us to be better neighbors." At home that night, Margaret sat in her living room, surrounded by the remnants of her orderly life. Her carefully curated bookshelves, her pristine furniture, and her neat stacks of garden magazines. None of it brought her comfort anymore. She replayed Angela's words in her mind. "A chance for us to grow together." Margaret realized she had spent so much time clinging to her vision of the neighborhood that she had failed to see the beauty in its evolution. Her inner turmoil deepened as she began to question the beliefs she had carried for decades. She thought of Marcus's earnest apology when he retrieved the soccer ball, Angela's grace at the meeting, and James's quiet dignity in the face of humiliation. For the first time, Margaret allowed herself to admit the truth. Her actions had been driven by fear, not of noise or disruption, but of change and difference. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Margaret's doorbell rang. She opened the door hesitantly, and to her surprise, Angela Williams stood there, holding a small basket of muffins. Angela smiled, though her expression held a hint of sadness. "Good morning, Ms. Winters," Angela said gently. "I thought I'd stop by." Margaret was caught off guard. She stepped aside and gestured Angela into her pristine living room, feeling an unfamiliar wave of discomfort in her own space. Angela placed the basket on the coffee table and sat down, her posture composed. "I wanted to talk," Angela began. "Not to accuse or argue, but to understand." Margaret's throat felt dry. She nodded but couldn't find the words to respond. Angela continued, "I know you made that call, and I know you probably had your reasons. But I also know what it felt like to explain to my kids why the police came to our house. It's not the first time we've dealt with something like this, but it doesn't get easier." Margaret felt her cheeks flush. She looked down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood," she said quietly. "I didn't mean for things to go so far." Angela's voice softened. "I understand that change can be hard. But James and I moved here because we wanted our kids to grow up in a place where they felt safe and accepted. That's all we want." For a long moment, the room was silent. Margaret's mind raced with memories of her own children growing up in the neighborhood, playing freely without a second thought. She thought of Marcus and Mia, who deserved the same innocence and joy. "I was wrong," Margaret said finally, her voice trembling. "I let my fear cloud my judgment. I'm sorry, Angela. Truly." Angela reached across the table and placed a hand on Margaret's. "Thank you for saying that," she said. "Apologies are a start, but change comes from action. I hope you'll join us in building a stronger community." That conversation stayed with Margaret long after Angela left. She couldn't stop thinking about the courage it must have taken for Angela to approach her, to extend an olive branch when she had every reason not to. The next day, Margaret took her first step toward redemption. She walked across the street to the Williams house, carrying a tray of cookies she had baked herself. It was a small gesture, but one she hoped would convey her sincerity. James answered the door, his expression cautious but polite. "Ms. Winters," he said. "I wanted to bring these over," Margaret said nervously, holding out the tray, "and to apologize to all of you. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to make amends." James hesitated before stepping aside. "Come on in," he said, his voice softening. Inside, Margaret found Angela and the children sitting in the living room. Marcus looked up from his homework, and Mia was coloring a picture of their family. Margaret felt a pang of guilt as she imagined how her actions had disrupted their lives. "I'm sorry for everything," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "I see now that I was wrong, and I hope you can forgive me." Angela smiled gently. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, Ms. Winters. It's about moving forward. And we're willing to do that, together." In the weeks that followed, Margaret became an active participant in the neighborhood's efforts to foster inclusivity. She attended community meetings, supported local events, and, for the first time, began truly engaging with her neighbors. One Saturday, the Williams family hosted another barbecue, and Margaret not only attended but brought her famous potato salad to share. She watched as Marcus and Mia played tag with other children, their laughter filling the air. This time, it didn't irritate her. It warmed her heart. Margaret realized that the neighborhood hadn't changed for the worse. It had simply grown, just as she needed to. Margaret sat on her porch one warm afternoon, sipping tea and watching as the neighborhood bustled with life. Children rode bicycles down the street, their laughter echoing in the crisp air. Neighbors stopped to chat, their faces lit with friendly smiles. Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. Her journey over the past few weeks had been humbling but transformative. She had become more than just a neighbor who lived among others. She was now a part of the community. She began volunteering with local initiatives, helping to organize events like block parties and charity drives. For the first time, she allowed herself to appreciate the diversity that made the neighborhood vibrant. Her relationship with the Williams family grew as well. Margaret frequently stopped by their home, often bringing baked goods or small tokens of appreciation. In turn, Angela would invite her to join them for coffee, and the children began to greet her warmly whenever they saw her. One afternoon, Margaret found herself helping Mia with a school art project. They sat at the dining table, surrounded by colored paper, glue, and glitter. Mia giggled as Margaret fumbled with the glue stick, her fingers sticky and clumsy. "You're funny, Ms. Winters," Mia said, her laughter contagious. Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. "I'm glad I can make you laugh," she replied. The final step in Margaret's transformation came during a neighborhood-wide potluck organized by the Williams family. Margaret, feeling more confident than ever, stood up to speak as the event was winding down. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady but emotional. "I want to take a moment to acknowledge something important. A few weeks ago, I made a mistake, one that hurt people I've come to care about deeply. It wasn't easy to face, but it taught me something valuable, that we all have the capacity to change if we're willing to listen and grow." She turned to James and Angela, who were seated nearby. "To the Williams family, I want to say thank you for your kindness, your forgiveness, and your patience. You've shown me what it truly means to be a good neighbor, and I'm grateful for the chance to learn from you." The crowd erupted in applause, and Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. Angela approached her, pulling her into a warm hug. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," Angela said softly, "and even more courage to make it right." As the evening came to a close, Margaret looked around at the faces of her neighbors, young and old, from different backgrounds and walks of life. She realized that the true strength of their community lay in its diversity and the connections they built with one another. The old Margaret might have resisted this change, but the new Margaret embraced it wholeheartedly. As she walked home that evening, the streetlights casting a warm glow on the sidewalk, Margaret felt a deep sense of contentment. She had found her place in the neighborhood, not as its gatekeeper, but as its ally and friend. She paused at her porch, taking in the sight of the Williams family laughing together as they packed up the last of the tables and chairs. For the first time in years, Margaret felt truly at home. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on the power of understanding, growth, and community. Let's challenge ourselves to be better neighbors and to embrace the diversity that makes us stronger. Remember, change starts with us. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more content that inspires and uplifts. Together, we can create a more inclusive world, one story at a time.